Mira Business FM, Dubai's home of business radio.
Mira Business FM, the morning drive. Here in the UAE, petrol prices are forecast to edge higher next month. It follows a brief dip earlier this year towards the end of last year. Joining us in the studio, as I mentioned just now, global oil and gas expert, strategic advisor at Ernst & Young Parthenon, Karan Gupta, to help us break down what's driving the market and what we can all expect, really. Karan, great to have you in the studio.
Pleasure to be here, Tim. Thank you.
We've talked over Zoom before, but it's always nice to kind of be eye to eye, of course. Look, let's start. What are the main reasons, if I can keep this relatively low level for the reasons of my grey matter, the main reasons the petrol prices in the UAE are expected to rise in February?
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you for having me. So the simple reason really is that there's more cars on the road, right?
Yeah.
Statistics from SALIC and RTA show that there was a 9% increase in new registrations last year. Mm-hmm. So there is, more cars on the road, and as we all know from the traffic this morning when you drove in, there's the population is only going to increase. But specifically in the short term and in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of geopolitical activity in the region.
Sure.
First of all, in Venezuela, where there was some events. Venezuela used to produce 880,000 barrels in December, and that fell to about 350,000 in Jan. So that's affecting the oil price. And then in Iran, we see naval forces from a foreign country moving into regional waters.
Geopolitical tensions,
yes,
as people term it, yeah, for sure.
So real, geopolitical tensions, and then, half of the world's exported oil on a daily basis goes through the Strait of Hormuz, yeah, which has had issues in the past. So there's a risk premium in the oil price, mm-hmm, and that's being factored in to what we're paying at the pump.
Okay, and of course that has a major influence on what we pay at the pumps here, because every month, prices are reevaluated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Gas prices move highly in correlation with oil prices, and albeit there's a little bit of a lag. So oil prices, for example, increased $8 a barrel in January compared to December, and so there is a chance that gets reflected in fuel prices. There are other reasons why the gas prices might move, factors such as refining margins and seasonal demand. But largely correlated with oil prices.
I mean, at the moment, for most people, we're reading of events in Venezuela, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about Venezuela if we have time slightly later on. But we're reading about that. We're reading about, global geopolitical tension. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about how things like this, events like naval build-ups or President Trump's introduction into Venezuela, let's put it that way, the role that they play in pushing fuel prices higher?
Sure. So, as I said, fuel prices are, what we pay at the gas here in the UAE, mm-hmm, is dependent on oil prices. But when it comes to setting the fuel price in the UAE, that's done on a monthly basis by this committee, right? And they don't use just the price of Brent crude. They look at international benchmarks.
Yes.
And that's why something that happens halfway across the world may affect what we pay at the pump here. So when it comes to Venezuela, what happens is there's now a risk factor that's priced into the price of oil. And that affects international benchmarks because that affects trade. Because no one country, is able to produce and survive on their own. There's imports and exports. So sure, the world is so interconnected. And that's why you see when benchmark prices rise, whether that's oil or diesel, you see an effect in the decision-making when it comes to setting the fuel price in the UAE.
Okay, and most people talk about Brent crude as being a benchmark, WTI West Texas Intermediary, as those are the two, I guess, big global benchmarks, aren't they, when it comes to determining an oil price average, really.
Those are definitely the global benchmark when it comes to looking at oil prices. Those are what you and I know of. The Fuel Pricing Committee actually uses the S&P Platts oil index out of Singapore, and then for diesel they use another S&P index out of northwestern Europe, and that kind of reflects the amount of diesel and natural gas being used for heating homes, for example.
Okay. What impact does OPEC and production decisions have on fuel prices in the UAE?
So OPEC today produces more than 40% of OPEC countries produce more than 40% of all the oil, right? Previously, that was higher. That was above 50%. So while their say is reducing as the U.S. expands production, as they have been over the last couple of years, they are still extremely influential. And that's why you see the UAE, Saudi, and key OPEC members making decisions such as production cuts or production freezes, because they're trying to temper or counteract the supply situation in the market.
This is interesting. I don't spend a lot of time talking about oil with people, and it's kind of, there's a juxtaposition there. I think you live in a country where the economy is so, or has been historically so impacted by the oil price, and it's so relevant for all of us here. And I think a lot of us don't. It's almost like we don't take it for granted, but we don't pay as much attention because it's omnipresent. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of so. It's fascinating to talk to you, even though we're talking at a relatively simple level, which of course is good. Global oil supply to me it appears relatively stable. The market is well supplied, perhaps oversupplied. Some would argue, I think. So if that's the case, why are prices under such pressure?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is in fact an oversupply in the market, according to the International Energy Agency. That tracks these things, there is supposed to be a surplus of 4 million barrels per day throughout the year. So there is an oversupply, and that supply is driven primarily by the Americas and the production coming out of there. But that's tempered by sort of production freezes coming out of OPEC countries such as the UAE. So OPEC members are showing remarkable constraint for the greater good. But the sort of the pricing pressure that you're seeing and what you're paying at the pumps is again based on geopolitical activity. And in fact, I would say that you would see a much higher spike, but that's being tempered by the oversupply. So there's this sort of push and pull or give or take when it comes to pricing.
It's a really fine balancing act, isn't it? So let's look close to home and look at if you can kind of outline how the UAE's monthly fuel pricing system works for petrol and for diesel.
Sure. So interestingly enough, before 2015, UAE fuel price was subsidized. So we'd pay a lot less than the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But since 2015, when the government has now modernized and moved with the market, which is actually good for everyone, the UAE prices are set on a monthly basis. So there's a fuel pricing committee, which is made up of members from the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Finance, representatives from ADNOC, ENOC, all of these companies. And instead of just using the Brent crude price that you and I know about and talk about a lot, they use this international S&P Platts index, which reflect traded prices in Singapore as well as for diesel, the index coming out of northwestern Europe. And they look at that as a primary factor, but then they also look at things such as refining margins. And because, for example, let's say there's an issue with a refinery and not as much crude is getting refined to be in a state where you can fill up your car, that might have an effect on supply of fuel that month. So they look at things like that as well before they make a final decision on what next month's pricing will be.
Okay, and that could be something as simple as, I don't know, a particular refining plant could have a breakdown or an issue, really as simple as that. Could it be that refining costs or seasonal demand are affecting prices this month, do you think?
This month is hard to say. I mean, it depends on, how much natural gas is being used to heat homes in Canada or the UK. So how bad the winter was.
I mean, it's been. I mean, I anecdotally, I know. I've got family in the UK. It's cold, so
Yeah.
they're using they're
Yeah,
using
absolutely.
heating
So
more.
it can be a driver because
Yeah.
that would affect the index, the international index that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So those are definitely factors. I would say in the UAE maybe we're a little bit insulated and we're not feeling that as much. But global demand cycles, how much heating oil is needed,
Yeah.
definitely play a part. But I think in this part of the world, apart from the geopolitical factors we talked about earlier, I think refining costs probably matter more.
Let's look at this and on a slightly more consumer level. What does a small increase in petrol prices mean for households? But also, and I think this is probably a more interesting thing for businesses as well.
Well,
Let's look at the impact.
Sure. I mean, I would say, do you drive an electric car or a gas-powered car? That would make a difference.
I'm good old internal combustion engine, unfortunately. I
Yeah,
suppose.
absolutely. So if you drive an ICE vehicle, you're gonna feel a little bit of a pinch. As a consumer, I fill up about once a week. I think that's average in the UAE, and it costs me about 150 dirhams. So let's say prices were to go up 6% next month at the most. That translates to 9 dirhams every time I fill up. So 40 to 50 dirhams a month on a household, significant, I think. But what's more significant, like you said, are businesses, right? Because businesses, especially those that rely on transport a lot, logistics businesses, your food delivery companies that we all love in the UAE, those will definitely feel more of a pinch because this goes directly to their operating costs.
Yeah, it does. And it is as simple as, isn't it? If we see an increase of 5%, potentially there's a little bit going to be on top of your coffee that you buy in the supermarket, the tomatoes that you buy. It translates as simply as that. It's something that we don't really think about, but it's expensive, the weekly shop these days.
Yeah, absolutely. It all translates back to the consumer at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll feel it. We'll feel a little bit.
And the other way of looking at it as well, as a consumer, I suppose, is as you point out there, if you pay 9 dirhams a week more, you're paying, I don't know, 40 or 50 dirhams a month over the course of a year. That's a pretty nice meal out for the family, isn't it? That
Absolutely.
you've spent on petrol. Okay. That gives us good perspective. Should we expect more increases in the coming months, do you think?
I think in the near term with
That's the how long is a piece of string question.
Yeah,
Pretty difficult to answer.
I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think with the current tensions that we see in the region and around the world, I think there's definitely a near to midterm effect where we'll see higher prices, but hopefully that eases out over the course of the year. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, it's very hard to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wanted to get your thoughts on something, just very briefly. The news stories over the last day or two, news that Saudi Arabia is lowering prices again for crude oil exports to Asia. And this is the light grade, Arab light grade crude, as it's called. So Asia's demand for Saudi crude rising. That's my first question, yes or no. Indian refiners perhaps replacing Russian oil with Middle Eastern supply. Does that point towards lower global oil prices when you see these kinds of actions?
So I'll start with your last.
There.
Yeah, I'll start with your last question first. So when it comes to pricing, that's largely dependent on supply and demand, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about a couple of factors. There is an oversupply, so I think OPEC showing restraint is probably keeping prices in check at the moment. When it comes to Saudi lowering prices or Saudi sending more crude to Asia, they're probably feeding into the refineries, right? So the refineries in India can take that oil, and then India has shown in recent months and years that they're going to go to the lowest supplier of oil, lowest price supplier of oil, right? They started buying oil from Russia when they could, and they are a energy-hungry country with the population and the energy demand. And they do produce oil, a significant amount of oil, but they can't keep up with the demand even internally, both consumer demand as well as demand from refineries. So I think it only makes sense that they're coming for light sweet crude from Saudi.
Okay. Final question, I suppose, and I guess in lots of ways, why did the US do what it did in Venezuela? Is it simply an oil play? I mean, there's clearly a great deal more at stake here, but you're here, so I need to ask the question.
Oh, that's putting me on the spot here.
It's a big one.
Look, I think what I can tell you is that the Gulf Coast refineries, that there's several refineries on the Gulf Coast in the US and there's some up in the Northeast, but they're set up to process crude oil, which typically comes from places such as Venezuela and Canada, oil sands in Canada. And now with easier access to some of that oil coming out of Venezuela, that'll feed the refineries and keep them busy. So it makes a lot of business sense.
Karan Gupta is a global oil and gas expert, making it easy for us this morning, and I appreciate that. You're also a strategic advisor at Ernst & Young Parthenon, and it's been good to talk to you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Tim.
Really appreciate it. Mira Business FM, it's the morning drive. Get in touch with the show. Tell us what you think. Social media, a like, a subscribe is always appreciated. And remember, everything that we do, all the content we produce is available to listen and or watch again on our website, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts from. Just look for Mira Business FM.